There's a generation right now that's being called the loneliest, the most anxious, the most fragile, and yet they're also the most informed, the most socially aware, the most unapologetically themselves. They grew up with the world at their fingertips, but somehow they feel more disconnected than any generation before them. They're told they're too sensitive, that they need thicker skin, that they should just put their phones down and go outside. But what if the way Gen Z thinks, feels, and survives isn't weakness at all? What if it's the most honest response to the world they inherited? When we talk about Gen Z, we're talking about people born roughly between 1997 and 2012. But more than a birth year, we're talking about a specific kind of psychological experience. These are people who've never known a world without the internet. They don't remember life before smartphones, before social media turned every private moment into a potential performance. They grew up watching the world burn in real time, scrolling through climate disasters, school shootings, economic collapse, and global pandemics before they were old enough to vote. Their inner world is a strange mix of hyper-awareness and emotional exhaustion. They know too much, too early. They can tell you about systemic oppression, mental health terminology, global politics, but they struggle to make a phone call without rehearsing it 5 times in their head first. They're activists and nihilists at the same time. They care deeply about justice, about being seen, about authenticity, but they also joke about not expecting to retire, about the world ending, about everything being hopeless anyway. In social settings, Gen Z operates differently. They value boundaries in ways previous generations didn't. They'll block you without explanation. They'll call out behavior that makes them uncomfortable. They communicate in memes and irony because sincerity feels too vulnerable, too risky. And yet, beneath all that detachment, there's a desperate need to be understood. They overshare online but can't open up in person. They're terrified of being cringe, of being too much, of being not enough. So where does this come from? Why does Gen Z carry the world like this? Let's start with childhood. Gen Z didn't just grow up with technology, they were raised by it. Many of them had iPads before they had conversations. Their emotional development happened in front of screens where every interaction was documented, where every mistake could be screenshotted and saved forever. There was no privacy, no room to be awkward and grow out of it quietly. Everything was permanent. From what I've observed, this created a generation that's hyper-conscious of how they're perceived. They learned early that the world is watching, that your value is tied to how many people validate you, that rejection isn't just personal, it's public, and that does something to a developing brain. It makes you perform your own life instead of living it. Then there's the emotional conditioning they received from the world around them. Gen Z grew up during the 2008 financial crisis, watching their parents lose jobs, lose homes, lose stability. They saw that hard work doesn't guarantee security. They watched millennials do everything right, go to college, get degrees, follow the rules, and still drown in debt and underemployment. So Gen Z learned a different lesson. The system is broken, and no amount of hustle will fix it. But maybe the deepest psychological wound comes from what I call the illusion of connection. Gen Z is the most digitally connected generation in history, and yet they report the highest levels of loneliness. They have 1,000 followers, but no one to call at 3 in the morning. They've been conditioned to believe that connection happens through screens, that relationships are supposed to be easy and instant and entertaining, but real intimacy is messy, it's slow, it requires vulnerability that doesn't come with a like button. In my opinion, this is where their anxiety lives. They've been taught to optimize everything, their image, their productivity, their relationships, but they were never taught how to simply be, how to sit with discomfort, how to exist without an audience. There's a concept in psychology about identity formation that feels particularly relevant here. Erik Erikson talked about how adolescence is the critical period where we figure out who we are, separate from our parents, separate from what society expects. But Gen Z is trying to form their identity in a space where everyone is watching and commenting in real time. They're building a sense of self while being constantly judged, compared, and curated. Research has shown that social media use, particularly during these formative years, is linked to increased rates of anxiety and depression. But I don't think it's just about screen time. I think it's about the nature of the feedback loop. Gen Z receives instant validation or rejection for everything they do. And the brain learns to crave that dopamine hit, that notification, that proof that you matter. But it's never enough, because it's not real connection. It's performance. There's also something psychologists call anticipatory anxiety, which is basically living in a state of constant worry about future threats. And Gen Z has been marinated in this. Climate anxiety, economic anxiety, political anxiety. They're told the planet is dying, that their future is uncertain, that everything is getting worse. And unlike previous generations who could tune out the news, Gen Z can't escape it. It's in their pocket, on their feed, in every group chat. From what I've observed, this creates a kind of psychological paralysis. Why plan for a future that might not exist? Why invest in long-term goals when the world feels like it's collapsing? So they live in the present, sometimes recklessly, sometimes with a dark humor that feels like armor. But here's where it gets complicated. Because Gen Z isn't one thing. They're walking contradictions, and that's part of what makes them so psychologically fascinating. They value authenticity more than any generation before them, but they also curate their lives more carefully. They'll post a raw, vulnerable caption about their mental health struggles, but they'll also spend 20 minutes choosing the right filter. They reject traditional definitions of success, but they're still terrified of failure. They say they don't care what people think, but they check their phones obsessively to see who's watching. They're deeply empathetic and aware of social issues, but they're also quick to cancel, to call out, to cut people off. They want grace for their own mistakes, but they struggle to extend it to others. And I think this comes from a place of pain. When you've been hurt by systems, by people, by the world, you become hypervigilant. You protect yourself by drawing hard lines. There's also this tension between independence and connection. Gen Z values self-reliance. They've learned not to depend on institutions, on governments, on anyone who might let them down. But at the same time, they're desperately lonely. They want community. They want to be held. But they don't know how to ask for it without feeling weak. In my opinion, this generation carries a kind of grief that they don't always have language for. Grief for a childhood that felt unstable. Grief for a future that feels uncertain. Grief for a version of the world that might have been kinder. You can see this playing out in small, quiet ways. The Gen Z college student who has a 4.0 GPA but can't get out of bed some mornings because everything feels pointless. The 22-year-old who's passionate about activism but scrolls doomishly for hours because the problems feel too big. The person who makes jokes about their trauma because actually talking about it feels too heavy, too real. You see it in the way they communicate. How they'll send a meme instead of saying, "I'm struggling." How they'll ghost someone instead of having a difficult conversation. How they'll say, "I'm fine," while their entire online presence screams otherwise. You see it in their relationships too. Gen Z is redefining what love and connection look like. They're less likely to get married young, less likely to follow traditional timelines. And it's not because they don't want love. It's because they're terrified of repeating the patterns they saw growing up. Divorce, dysfunction, disappointment. So they protect themselves by keeping distance, by staying non-committal, by convincing themselves they're better off alone. So what does all of this mean? I don't think Gen Z is broken. I don't think they're fragile or entitled, or any of the things they're so often called. I think they're responding as honestly as they can to a world that handed them chaos and told them to figure it out. They were raised in instability and asked to be stable. They were given technology that connected them to everything and left them feeling connected to nothing. They were taught to care about the world and then punished for caring too much. And maybe the most important thing to understand about Gen Z is this: their sensitivity isn't weakness, it's awareness. They see the cracks in systems that older generations learned to ignore. They feel the weight of injustice that others have become numb to. They refuse to pretend everything is fine when it's not. From what I've observed, this generation is carrying something heavy, something that's part inheritance and part choice. They didn't ask for the world they were born into, but they're trying to make sense of it anyway. They're trying to build identity in a time when identity is currency. They're trying to find meaning in a culture that often feels meaningless, and they're doing it while being told they're doing it wrong. But maybe they're not doing it wrong. Maybe they're just doing it differently. Maybe the loneliness, the anxiety, the exhaustion, maybe it's not a flaw in them. Maybe it's a reflection of the world we've built. And maybe the fact that they refuse to accept it, that they keep asking for better, for more, for something real, maybe that's not fragility. Maybe that's courage. Gen Z didn't create this mess, but they're the ones who have to live in it the longest, and they're doing it with more honesty than we probably deserve.